All right, so I'll be talking about how to review a paper. I've also thought just how to discuss things with someone, which is sort of a point in itself. So when you're reviewing a paper, imagine you're talking to a person and have the sense of a real person, a fellow human being in front of you, which you're talking about, which doesn't mean that you have to sign your reviews. So there is an issue of whether you sign your reviews or not. As an early career researcher, you might think your best interest is not to sign your reviews. That's fine. I think anyone with a permanent position should sign the reviews. But apart from that, even when I wasn't signing my reviews, even as a starting lecturer, because I felt people are very thin-skinned and you never know when you insult them, or, even when you're not trying to. But I still imagined that there was a person in front of me and I was having a discussion with them. So what I want to give you is sort of a philosophy of how you would approach such a discussion. And it will be maybe somewhat idiosyncratic, in other words, sort of my personal approach. So just make of it what you will and see how you relate to it. So I'd like to start with a piece of philosophy that I always have in the back of my mind when I approach this issue. And it's Popper's notion of objective knowledge. And what he means by that is, when you invent a theory, it has properties which you don't necessarily know about. So it might be consistent or inconsistent with other claims. It might make certain predictions. You don't have to know about that when you invent the theory. That's something to be found out. So there's a difference between what you subjectively think about the theory and the actual properties of the theory. So the theory might make certain predictions that you don't know about. It's a matter of finding out. That's sort of very obvious in the case of, within psychology, computational models. Whereas if I build some neural network, for example, I've got to run the network to see what it does. I can't just say what it does. I've got to find it out. And I can be wrong about what I might think the network might behave a certain way. It doesn't mean it will behave that way. It has its own objective properties, objective in the sense that I can be wrong about it. But that point is true about any theory. Any theory will have properties that you can be wrong about, and in that sense is objective. And from the point of view of theory testing, a particular theory, and sort of by theory I mean it could be something like any very interesting general claim that you could show to be wrong. For example, your intrinsic motivation to do something. In other words, the motivation to do something because of the enjoyment of the activity in itself is reduced by external motivation, external reward. So if you're paid to do something you enjoy, you might enjoy it less afterwards. So that's sort of general theory that's been out there for decades and seems rather plausible. That could make a prediction that if you say to your children or your brothers and sisters or nieces and nephews, you must eat your greens in order to get the dessert, then that reduces the intrinsic value of the greens, because the only reason they're eating the greens is to get the dessert. So that would be a phenomenon. So the substantial theory is the most general theory, it makes predictions. And you might not realise that this general theory of intrinsic motivation applies to children's eating in that way. It's something you have to find out. And the theory implies certain effects in certain experiments if you make certain simple assumptions, but it doesn't imply other effects, like some complicated interaction with gender doesn't follow naturally from the theory. That's a sort of certain facts of the matter about our state of knowledge. And then you collect data, and the data have a certain evidential bearing on the predictions, the predicted phenomena. And you can be wrong about those characterizing that relationship. That's why it's objective. if it wasn't objective, you couldn't be wrong about it. You could be wrong about it, for example, by p-hacking. When someone p-hacks, they misrepresent the evidential relationships between the data and the prediction. And the only way to sort of see p-hacking as wrong is to understand there are objective relationships here between data and predictions that you can be wrong about subjectively in your personal beliefs. So knowledge objectively exists and one can be subjectively wrong about it. Okay, so that's sort of Popper's principle of objective knowledge. If one can be wrong about something, it must have an existence independent of one's subjective knowledge. There are objective relations between theories, predictions and data. So p-hacking is wrong precisely because it results in misrepresenting certain relationships. But I think you can go further and say the difference between an academic discipline investigating some field and, say, religion, mythology and so on, is in an academic discipline you consider the arguments for their own sake. So, in other words, it doesn't matter, or it shouldn't matter, in terms of how compelling an argument is for its own sake, that you consulted an authority or not. So in religion, you might go to the Delphi Oracle, or the Pope says thus and thus, and it is so. That's not an academic discipline for that very reason. So that is sort of my philosophical background, which, so I don't know if that sounds complicated or easy, but it's sort of the basis of everything, of my whole approach to what I'm going to say and how I review papers and how I discuss science. Any questions on that? In other words, to put it simply, we're just interested in arguments for their own sake. That's it. So your aim in reviewing the paper or in having discussion with someone is just to consider the arguments as such. So I hope that's a simple point, but you'll find that it's often violated, and when reviewing goes wrong, I think it's because this point has been violated. So I want to discuss what it means to take this seriously. So what you don't need to do, or what I don't do, is comment on any characteristics of the author, like their general competence or their perceived authority. That's not to say bias is not important. If a person has a vested interest, then that's a certain fact that's relevant in terms of assessing their ability to judge these objective relationships. But let's just consider how this might play out in a simple case. You might be tempted to say something like, the author is mistaken when they say blah, blah, blah. But how about just saying, just take the author out of it, consider the claim, what is the mistake? This claim is inconsistent with that claim. That's the important point, right? It's not important that you are mistaken. That then elevates the discussion to a personal level that's completely unnecessary for a productive discussion about what's going on. So, very similarly, your theory that, and it's very tempting to bring in ownership of theories and claims when you're having a discussion with someone about the science. But when you say your theory that and you launch into prolonged criticism, you're making this personal. In other words, there's no longer a discussion about the arguments as such. It's someone's reputation and personal dignity at stake, and that completely changes the dynamics of the discussion. By the same, so instead of saying your theory that, you just say the theory that, this theory is contradicted by this theory. That's the point, and that's all that matters. It doesn't matter that it's their theory, it might be their theory, but that's irrelevant, and the more you bring it up, bring up personal ownership, the less, you can say, mindful people will be about the discussion, and the more you're making this I'm right, you're wrong type of thing. in the same way, if you're going to put it that way around, also by consistency it applies the other way around. So you can say, well, it might be tempting to say, you have this theory, but I have this other theory. And that also is again making it personal. So I don't state my theory, even if it is, I think, my theory, but that's irrelevant normally for having a productive discussion. It's just this theory is consistent with these findings, not with these findings. So these are points I've sort of, I don't know where I picked this up. Maybe I was reading Popper from very young. It's not that Popper says exactly to do these things I just said, but those are things I watch myself doing when I'm talking. Let's say I'm asking a question at the end of the colloquium. I might feel myself, your theory, then I try and catch myself in time and just say it doesn't, because then you're not putting the person on the spot. What you're trying to do is encourage an attitude of mutual curiosity and collaboration to understand what would be the best explanation for a certain set of facts and what the facts are. And that's the attitude you want to develop and encourage in any sort of discussion about science, including the review process. Now, Daniel Dennett gave some rules which I think are very good and relate to what I've been talking about, rules of scientific discussion. He calls them Rappaport's rules, so Rappaport first gave a version of these, but I know them via Dennett. So you should attempt to express your target's position so clearly, vividly and fairly that your target says, thanks, I wish I thought of putting it that way. So, in other words, I mean, one thing Popper says is don't attack the weakest version of your opponent's argument, criticise the strongest version, is another way of putting it. Because if ultimately what you're interested in is not whether they're right or they're wrong, but what's the best explanation, you should take your interlocutor's position and wonder what is the strongest version of this, the best version of this that might explain the facts that we're interested in. Because then you're making progress in terms of objective knowledge. When you're writing a review, it's good practice to summarise very briefly, just could be a few sentences, what is the paper saying. So this is fairly common. It's not sort of generally required, but probably most people, most reviewers do it. They try and write down what the paper was about and what it found and what was important about it. And so when you do that, you can, if you choose to do that, you can think of this point. Think about how can I put this, what this paper has done, in the strongest terms possible in terms of what the paper has achieved. In terms of possible explanations. That incidentally not only helps develop the best explanations of what we're interested in, it also lets the other person know that you appreciate the strength of their argument. Because if you didn't do that and you never acknowledge the strength of their argument, when you give a criticism, they might be thinking, yeah, but you don't really understand what's good about what I'm saying. I need to say it again, and then maybe you'll drop the criticisms. But if you acknowledge what's right about what they're saying, it helps the discussion progress. So in sort of very similar spirit, you should list any points of agreement, especially if they're not matters of general or widespread agreement. So that also lays the stage of knowing the common ground, and it also just sort of validates the other person. It sort of helps, if you're going to launch into some criticism, it helps them keep their dignity. So it has that psychological effect, and helps them understand that you do understand what's right about what they're saying. You should, same spirit, you should mention anything you've learned from your target. It's not just you patronisingly criticising them. Actually, you've learned from them. I think that also helps keeping mutual respect in the discussion. only then are you permitted to say so much as a word of rebuttal or criticism. So Rappaport's rules, as expressed here by Dennett, could be your template for writing a review. Indeed, you could bear these in the back of your mind. Of course, in free discussion, you can't always go through all these points exactly like that. But that sort of spirit of things, I think, is always one worth bearing in mind. So my aim, anyway, is to have the following feeling. And, of course, different people have different aims, but I think this is sort of a healthy feeling to have. We are collaborating by being curious about the properties of the theories, the data, the stats. In other words, the objective knowledge that we're interested in. We want to understand the properties of that objective knowledge. We're being mutually curious and collaborative about understanding that. And we do that by trying to take out ego and personal involvement in the discussion. Now, you might find your interlocutor doesn't adopt this attitude. Either a reviewer of your paper, most likely, is not behaving like this. It would be good practice if nonetheless your reaction to it was still, I think, as I say, this is personal, I can't tell you what to do, it's your own business. But what my philosophy is, if you can restrain yourself to respond in this manner, to keep saying to yourself, what's actually important here, what are the best explanations of the facts, and what is the evidence, and so on. It's not important who's right, who's wrong, and so on. Put it in a way, I don't know, I mean, I was born in the 60s, and transactional analysis was becoming big then, and they had this notion that we can think of the human as having different psychological states, parent, adult, child. I don't know if that means anything to you. But I think it's fairly transparent what the terminology is. So the idea is you're not a parent talking to a child, right? The attitude should be more, you're an adult talking to an adult. That's the type of attitude you're trying to develop. Now, there is a tendency, I think, amongst lots of people, when an author says something obviously wrong, the reviewer or the social media poster thinks the author's trying to pull a fast one. Now, it's possible that they are, but it's still best to presume that they're not, because in many cases they won't be. They just have different views than you. And it's not that they're trying to pull a fast one on you or take the piss, it's just that they're approaching this from a different point of view. And you're going to make most progress if you treat it in the manner that I've been talking about. One way to think about this is, especially when you come to a paper as a reviewer, you'll get papers from different labs, maybe somewhat different disciplines, people with different training, different backgrounds. And you in your lab may have been told this is the right way of doing things and this is wrong. And there might be a strong opinion in your lab about what's right and what's wrong. And one of the, I think, sort of characteristics of early career researchers when they write reviews is they take that training they had extremely seriously. Well, it was your training and it was your mentor who said it, and they were very important and right people. But what you learn as you get on in your career is there are different viewpoints and there are different approaches. And in some of these cases where you might have felt there's an absolute right and wrong, other people think the opposite, and there might be arguments for and against each of those positions. And so some flexibility is probably called for. And really it's akin to what it's like to come from one culture and go to another culture. And trying to determine what is actually right, what is actually wrong, and what is just different can be a difficult matter when there's a meeting of two different cultures, especially for the first time. So I went to China for every year for about 10 years. So it's a different culture. And I went to Beijing and also East China Normal University in Shanghai. And particularly in the Shanghai lab, there's very much a Chinese culture. And what that meant was that I, as a professor, was treated, well, I suppose you could say in a Confucian way, by the students. So if I was carrying anything at all, and there was a PhD student there, they would not tolerate me carrying something. They had to carry it themselves. And I was, another example, I was giving a talk, and I couldn't find, it was a whiteboard, I couldn't find the eraser. This PhD student sprinted up, grabbed it, handed it to me, sprinted back to his seat. And I thought, oh God, I've got to take the UK PhD students to this place and let them learn how professors should be treated. But you might be thinking, is it really right that there's so much reverence? Does that encourage a critical tradition? Might it not actually hold back things? Or is it just a different culture? So these things can be hard to judge. But that's what you have to do when you're being a reviewer, is bear in mind that this person could have come from a very different lab culture with different presumptions and assumptions and ways of thinking about things. And you might want to check, if you're sure that something is wrong, just check it with someone else and ask around. Is this just one view? But if you take the sort of approach that I've been suggesting, it doesn't matter so much, because you're not going to say it is wrong to do this or you're wrong to do this, blah blah blah. You'll say this approach, this claim that you're using contradicts this claim. Then they can deal with it as they will. They can come back to you with a counter argument. You've turned it into something about them being definitely wrong, just to saying, well, this claim that you're presuming contradicts this claim. They might deny the other claim. Might be an interesting discussion. You don't need to turn it into someone's absolutely right and someone's absolutely wrong. All right, so now what I'd like you to do is introduce yourself to a person next to you. Then one of you describe either an experiment that you've done or that you're planning to do, just for a few minutes. So imagine this is a mini review. But now I want you to follow Rappaport's rules. So then the other person, just let the other person describe it how they want. And if you're describing your experiment, you can say my idea, my experiment. Forget about anything I've said, just talk as you naturally talk. This is how the paper is going to come to you. But then you, as a sort of evaluator of it, the other person, what I'd like you to do is, first of all, summarise what they've said and put it in as strong a version as you can, which might not be stronger than what they said. It's just something you have in the back of your mind. You're not trying to make it sound terrible when you repeat it back. You're trying to make it sound as good as possible, which might be pretty similar to what they say, but it's just an attitude that you have. Say what you've learnt about it and what you agree about it, and then say if there's any critical comments you want to make about it. But bearing in mind, you're not going to say, I think you're wrong when you said this. You're going to say, this claim is contradicted by this claim. Does that make sense? All right, so go.
Okay, so I've got some people looking at how you were looking at people with anxiety or so I was testing training so that paper was a series of ambiguous scenarios. As they're reading it, they're presented with a word and then we're seeing it from the story and in there, we know how it is, and just working on the interpretation side, that sort of thing. So that we're going to approach recently who are going to university or secondary education and ask them to write a test. So they were writing to a year students and talk about how they felt about their body when they were in the community and how that changed in justice and how they are now. And it has an impact in a positive way, and then create a confident Exactly, yeah, that's kind of the idea, yeah, if you're less aware of what's happening, maybe they'll that superliminal versions have worked on it, but I'm just interested to see how this works.
It's really interesting because
evaluate it according to the principles. So like, these yeah, evaluate the theory rather than
yeah, and that is very true.
I know, so we put that out on the
Another way that community council doing that is advisories when you're asking for feedback. With the way to ensure
yeah, I'm recording it, so I'll probably use it. All right. How did you?
Does everyone understand this?
Pizza is in the other room.
In the other room. Thank you very much.
How do people find that? Any comments people want to make? Any questions about anything I've said, or just open it up freely now before we go for pizza? We can carry on discussion, of course, but while things are in your mind, is something you want to say?
It's difficult to critique research because we were both talking about studies that we were about to do.
Yes.
What we did find is when we were sort of making comment about them, reflect about. I think I certainly didn't. I don't know if you just stop myself saying your study or your something, and
Yes.
changed it to the approach or the
Yes,
your
yes.
approach. So that was
No, it's a definite
useful thing. It's something you do naturally, isn't it? Your approach.
Exactly.
Yeah. So
Criticising a study before it's done is what happens in a registered report, of course, so that is also a very valuable thing. So that is something you could be asked to do as a reviewer of the stage one registered report. Yes?
This is slightly unrelated, but still a review question. How much time do you think that early career scientists should devote to review?
Early career researchers devote more time to reviewing, to a single review, than a late stage researcher does. But
how many reviews?
how many reviews should you be doing? I don't think there's a number of how many you should be doing. I think probably typically for a PhD student you might never be asked to do a review. If you are asked to do a review, it's good to bring your supervisor in on it to guide you through the process. In fact, sometimes a PhD student is asked to review because the supervisor's been asked, and then they say, well, yeah, which isn't just offloading their work onto you, but as long as they take a role in evaluating what you've done and giving you guidance, it can be valuable.
So you only ever review when someone invites you?
Yes, that's the standard model. There are some models around where, particularly with the preprint server process now, where you can go and I should have looked up the website. There's a preprint. There's a special website. There's probably a few of these now where you can volunteer to review certain preprints. In peer community you can also volunteer to review papers, but that's a very rare process. It's typically a matter of invitation, so that typically happens after you've published at least one paper and probably several, which means it probably happens at the postdoc stage onwards. But if you do get a chance, it's a good thing to do to help you. It helps you just think about research and your own research. It's like teaching. Teaching is good for your own learning, so reviewing is good for your own research as well. Anything else you want to say? Any questions on reviewing generally?
So we are asked not to use your theories, but what if it
Well, that's just what I'm saying.
yeah,
So
yeah, which makes sense if it is a negative thing. But if it is a positive comment,
yeah.
should we still not do it? Like
Yeah, I just have as a general rule, as I say, this is entirely personal, but I just say the theory might say the theory has strong support from this. Indeed, if I think of a way the theory is supported that the author hasn't mentioned, that's something I might say. I might say the theory that blah 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 is actually supported by this finding. I just always put it that way. So it's always a sense of collaborating together in a mindful, in other words, decentered way on the topic. Shall we get pizza then? All right, thanks very much.
Thank you.